Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this session, From Ideas to Reality, Getting to a Guaranteed Income. The goal of the session is to distill some of the key questions that are necessary to designing and delivering a guaranteed income that achieves its full potential in the lives of people who need it the most. I'm your moderator, Rachel Black. I'm a Associate Director of the Financial Security Program at the Aspen Institute. A lot of the questions that we're going to be exploring today, such as how do you find the people you want to give basic income to, and then how do you get it to them? How often should you get it? How big should these payments be? And what is the role of a basic income amongst the larger ecosystem of other social policies? Luckily, over the last year, researchers at the Jain Family Institute, an applied research organization leading policy and program design and research in the field of guaranteed income, have worked to answer these questions in a series, coincidentally, also titled From Idea to Reality, Getting to a Guaranteed Income. So in this session, we have Steve Nunez, a lead researcher on guaranteed income at the Jain Family Institute, and Sidya Balarashkan, who is the Director of Research at JFI, and they will present their findings from the first two papers in the series. The first, Building a Helicopter, which focuses on the plumbing necessary to implement a federal basic income policy, and the second, Reweaving the Safety Net, which focuses on how to integrate a basic income into the broader social policy ecosystem. So following their presentation, we'll be hearing from, a really all-star panel here. We have Matt Darling, who's a vice president at Ideas 42, and Elaine Mag, who's a principal research associate at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. But before we get into it, a few housekeeping notes. I'm sure everybody here at this point is a seasoned user of Crowdcast, but just in case, if you'd like to submit a question to the speakers, please post in the Ask a Question section below. You may also vote on questions already posted by other attendees, and this will help us prioritize what to ask. Next, there's a chat box where you can hold side conversations, and where we will also be posting links to other supplemental information. And in order to keep things moving, we may not get around to responding to any activity in the chat. So just please be sure to submit a question using the Ask a Question function. And with that, I'll pass it over to Steve and Sidya.
Thanks, Rachel. You actually did my introduction for me, so that was nice and quick. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. We, at the beginning of last year, started thinking about what exactly do we know and not know about making guaranteed income policy. We have ideas about what it should look like, but what are the practical considerations we need to think about when we think about actually a policy which resembles guaranteed income or a basic income. So based on that, we decided to write a series, and the first two are the ones we are presenting. Apologies in advance, they're two very long papers, so we're going to go very, very quickly, but we will share the slides with anyone who is interested. So the first paper, where we talked about building a helicopter, what are the targeting and disbursement challenges that we face? What we argue is that GI or guaranteed income can be seen as a response to the problems of the existing social safety net, which has means tests, targets specific populations, excludes some populations. And this was highlighted through the COVID crisis, which was an acute economic and financial shock. And we saw a lot of people who did not receive the CARES Act stimulus payments or were left out of it, which we'll talk about in a bit. And we think that guaranteed income as a policy could help us insulate against future crises, but only if we build the infrastructure to allow it. And what do we mean when we talk about infrastructure? We mean, do we have comprehensive systems to target people we want the guaranteed income to be disbursed to, and do we have disbursement mechanisms in place to ensure that people can get it, especially people who are outside of the formal banking system? And what we argue is that this infrastructure is not in place because that's not what existing government systems have been designed for. They're designed specifically for particular populations, for particular kinds of need, as well as conditionality associated with it. So with that, we move into just a case study of the CARES Act. In the paper itself, we also look at different targeting and disbursement mechanisms used across the world, as well as local initiatives in the US. But we want to use CARES as an example, a case study, and Steve is going to take us through that.
Yeah, since CARES Act was very, I guess, at the center of our attention at the time that we were writing this, we were thinking of it as a bit of a case study. It certainly helped millions of people, but it faced many of the same constraints as the existing welfare programs, because of course it was piggybacking off of those systems to get aid to people. There was problems with slowness, there were problems with the lack of comprehensiveness and poor targeting. So we have some stats here about folks unable to receive their unemployment claims by the end of May of 2022, that there were still 12 million people in June who had not received their initial check, and that there were some faulty data issues because the IRS was using 2018, 2019 tax returns to means test rather than instead doing it, on the back end. Things got better with later iterations of that aid, but some of the same problems remained, and we're going to talk about that. Certainly, we lack an integrated federal database to identify and target households for cash assistance. Probably about 90% of families in the country are present in some or another federal database, but those databases aren't necessarily talking to each other. There are additional households that can be covered if you extend out to state benefits records, like, for example, SNAP and WIC through the EBT systems. But then, of course, there are just households in the informal economy, especially those who are undocumented, who are just not in any of the records at all. We currently rely very heavy on paper checks, partly because of the outdated bank data that the IRS had to use. You saw some of that with the CARES Act checks, but also because there are a lot of families that are just unbanked and don't actually have a receptacle for a direct deposit. There is a federal prepaid debit card system that works fairly well for the Social Security Administration, but that the IRS doesn't typically use. But of course, it doesn't operate yet at a sufficient scale to meet the sort of needs that we're talking about, which is giving checks to essentially every man, woman, and child in the United States on a monthly basis. And of course, the unbanked and the underbanked cannot access aid easily without recourse to expensive middlemen. That means at the front end, a lot of folks have to use paid tax prep, and on the back end, they have to use, again, paid tax prep or, for example, check cashers to get access to their aid. So how can we improve things? Well, at the simplest level, we can improve coordination between the IRS and the Social Security Administration. We talk a little bit about some pie-in-the-sky ideas, I think, which could help in the very long run, including things like better integration between the federal government and state administrative benefit systems, and also even things like federalization of UI and the use of the national database of new hires. We also note, of course, that integrating databases would raise privacy issues. But right now what we have is a hodgepodge of multiple access points to aid, which means that there are multiple gaps and people falling through the cracks. How can we improve disbursement? Well, in the short run, I think the expansion of the direct express system and phasing out of paper checks. In later sort of disbursements of the stimulus checks, they did start to rely at least somewhat on the direct express system, but couldn't completely switch over to it, just given the size and scope of the issues. But in the long run, I think we need to think about public banking options to reach those folks who are unbanked or so underbanked that this is really just going to be an issue. Because in the end, what we really want is something like a direct electronic transfer into a bank account, nothing getting lost in the mail or stolen. That would mean that we'd want to look into things like Fed accounts or postal banking or some combination of the two. And in the paper, we review a few proposals that others have put forward to try to essentially get to close to 100% coverage of households using these and other methods.
So yeah, so our central thesis there is that we have limitations in targeting and disbursement, and we need to address them either through integrating systems or creating new systems, while understanding that there are inherent flaws which we need to keep in mind while building platforms for guaranteed income. But at the same time, apart from those administrative challenges, we also have challenges on if there are extremely frequent disbursements, how will the systems manage that, or the amounts, if they are extremely large, how they will manage that. So that led us to our second paper, where we look at three main questions, which is, what does guaranteed income look like in terms of size and frequency? Do we know the answer to that question? Which programs might a guaranteed income replace, complement, and substitute? And if it does need to be complemented, what are those interventions? And when we think about these questions, we are looking at guaranteed income as a policy which is universal, or at least more broadly targeted than the existing safety net programs, and they're not conditioned on employment, training, or any other activities. And as Steve mentioned, we are also thinking of paying back or how to pay for it as something that happens in the back end rather than upfront means testing. And these, the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend, the UBI, or a carbon tax dividend, are examples of potential policies which can use this framework of guaranteed income. So when we go to the first question on what do we know about frequency of transfers and what do we think should be the optimal frequency of disbursement, the answer is we do not know. There's extremely limited evidence in terms of having a single site or a single research project examining different frequency of payments together in the same research project, which is essential for us to understand how people may have different needs. While we do know that unconditional cash has positive impacts on material hardship and psychological, physical well-being, and so on, very few studies have actually examined how they might be different based on frequency of payments. And the choice of frequency of payments has important implications, as I mentioned, in terms of administration, but also on that recipient well-being. Some studies in developing country contexts have actually shown that more frequent payments are used for smoothing consumption or making ends meet and not going into substantial debt just to survive on a day-to-day basis, while more lump sum payments or less frequent payments are used to actually build savings and to actually invest in durables and investments. So people may have credit and savings constraints, and therefore lump sum payments really help those kind of households to actually invest in human capital investment, for example, or invest in a car or particular entrepreneurship activity, which would help them in terms of income mobility. So there's not necessarily a single best frequency. In different situations, people have different needs and would have a different preference for frequency. In the US, we had a pilot for the EITC in Chicago where they did do a treatment arm where they had quarterly payments instead of lump sum, and we saw the same finding there. But there's very limited evidence in terms of unconditional cash in the US to understand different needs, different constraints, and how people would be using it and what are the variations in terms of findings.
So that is, in fact, the focus of our study in Compton, the Compton Pledge.
Yes. The Compton Pledge is using 2 treatment arms where one arm is getting it every 2 weeks and one is getting it every quarter. So that's exciting. Hopefully findings, it's an RCD, so maybe in 5 years. And the other main question is, what is the optimal amount? And the answer to that is also, we do not know. We talk about $500 a month and $1,000 a month, but we don't know if that's the optimal cash transfer amount. Cost of living is different and very varied across the US, and in every locality it'll be different. It might be too little, it might be too much. And it's also important to understand optimal amounts in terms of cost-benefit perspective, like if you're replacing a policy, do you have, what is the maximum optimal amount you should be providing? At the same time, we do need to understand whether there's a decreasing marginal impact per dollar. So does an additional dollar have a linear effect in terms of effect sizes and well-being? And the answer to that is there hasn't been, again, studies or research in developed country contexts which examine this question very deeply. The same study I mentioned in Kenya did examine this. They see linearity of effects, but of course contexts are different and we need to examine them here as well. So we feel as a future pilots, research and research questions should examine questions of amount and frequency because they are crucial to understand what this optimal guaranteed income, if there is an optimal guaranteed income, looks like. And once we have that, or in parallel, we also need to understand how that fits into the social safety net in terms of what policies it complements and replaces.
Yeah, I think the really overarching question here when it comes into this is if we give somebody money with some frequency and some amount, we know they're better off. But the question is better off compared to what and how much better off? And you see that in these discussions about frequency and amount, but you also see it in terms of the role of the safety net of guaranteed income. What problem is this solving, and where is it going to do the most good? And we basically argue that it's best to think of, and this is a program that we've done with Michael Lewis, the sociologist, the local sociologist. The existing safety net programs, we think, play more than one role. They play the role of income support and or of insurance provision. And we think that guaranteed income is best thought of as an income support program, not as a form of public insurance. There are other income support programs, SNAP, EITC, TANF, et cetera, and they tend to be burdensome on recipients, and they can exclude a substantial group of those most in need. So we think that guaranteed income is a very good way to provide income support. In fact, perhaps the best way to provide income support, because it can be more generous and less burdensome, and it will cover more individuals. In general, income support is what you do when markets work well. And when markets work well, you give people cash and you let them meet their needs by engaging in those markets. So I think guaranteed income is a really good way to replace programs that are primarily about income support. But if markets aren't working well, if there are market failures, it may mean that more than guaranteed income is needed. That could mean some kind of supply side intervention, or if it's a very severe issue, it could mean direct service provision, as in the case of insurance markets. What are we saying about income support? It's targeted, it's conditional, it's restricted in use, and any given program in the United States is fairly stingy. So of course, a guaranteed income is preferable to any one of those things, from our perspective. And it is the case that most households only receive some kind of pre-tax benefit will receive only SNAP or Medicaid. So for those folks, giving them a guaranteed income instead of these programs is a win-win. But there is a minority of programs that actually receive deep assistance because they receive 3 or more benefits. So even though you'd be removing administrative burden, you'd be removing the benefits cliffs, you could be dealing in part with this high marginal implicit tax rate on the back end or on the front end. The typical GI that we're talking about for some of these families, especially those who are receiving housing choice vouchers or other kind of housing support, would not be enough to cover all of these programs. So if you simply removed them all, there would be a small group of people, but important group of people who could be made worse off. These are fairly small programs. For example, HCV is only about $20 billion. So we don't have to remove these programs to fund GI. It's not going to contribute very much. So you might consider keeping these sorts of programs around, but doing things to make them more GI-like so that they are less burdensome, like, for example, turning them into cash and changing the way that they're funded. But now think about public insurance. Well, if you have a large shock that is a rare event or one that's unpredictable, probably the best way to deal with something like that is insurance because of risk pooling. It's a lot cheaper to do it this way than to do it through savings or credit. It's also the case that it is difficult to gauge risk and to understand exactly what you're up against in terms of length and depth of a negative event, so how much you should save and so forth. So even if you are able to do savings and credit, it might not be the best way to do it because it's very difficult to predict. So it's better to buy insurance if it's available. And of course, if insurance is available, you don't really need to do anything other than give people money. If markets are working well, guaranteed income works well. But insurance might not be available because of incomplete insurance markets, and it may be a situation where people cannot get insurance at all, or some major important parts of the population can't receive insurance because of things like adverse selection. So we're thinking about things like unemployment and disability, and to the extent that Social Security actually plays an insurance role, not just an income support role, things like insurance for retirement and survivors benefits. Since there would be no private insurance products to purchase for many people in the absence of these things, the expensive and error-prone savings and credit strategy would become the only option without public insurance provision. So our argument is that if you simply got rid of these things, it's true that if you got rid of them and replaced them with a guaranteed income, the average household would probably be better off in a given year. But of course, people who suffered particularly adverse events would suffer. And in any given year, some subset of households differing in any given year could suffer. Now, of course, you could protect against this by making a sufficiently large guaranteed income. If everybody's receiving $30,000 a year or whatever, these sorts of shocks are not deep enough to really be a problem. The problem is that that would be a very expensive program, and as we've already noted, there's an opportunity cost in providing such a program. And there are other things that the safety net needs to do that are also valuable. And of course, that's not even getting into the political feasibility issue. So instead, we suggest that in some instances, it makes sense to think of programs like unemployment insurance or jobs guarantee, if that's the way you want to do it, as a complement to rather than a substitute or replacement for guaranteed income. These are really not addressing the same problems. So just to close up, what's next? Well, our next paper is going to be on the macroeconomics of guaranteed income. And as I noted, many of the programs that we're talking about replacing with a guaranteed income and the income provision, income support, sort of social provision, are fairly small. So it's unlikely that you could fully finance a guaranteed income program simply by pruning and consolidating these existing programs, at least if you want to create a fairly substantial GI. So that means that you might also have to consider raising new taxes. And if you want to understand the effects of on the economy, on inflation, on economic growth, on unemployment and wages and so forth, ultimately, you need to understand these things because whether a given guaranteed program is worth the cost, we'll have to consider the macroeconomic impacts. And of course, in order to do that, we have to consider how policy is funded. And you can't necessarily do this with pilots or with natural experiments, so you turn to modeling. And there is a small but growing literature examining these questions right now through macroeconomic modeling. For example, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling. That's what we're talking about. So with the macroeconomist Claudia Sam, who's joined us for this year as a senior fellow, we are reviewing that literature. We're noting some gaps in the modeling approaches. For example, the absence of neo-Keynesian, new Keynesian models, heterogeneous agent new Keynesian models. And we'll be exploring some of the notable findings, including some of the counterintuitive feedback mechanisms that fall out of these modeling exercises. And we're working on the draft as we speak, and we're hoping to have it ready to share publicly next month in July.
Yes, and then after that, we also wanted to look at another research question, which is whether framing of guaranteed income influences public opinion, and that hopefully is going to be in the fall of this year. So 2 more papers coming, and we'll stop here. And I'll apologize for traffic. We are in New York City. Can't do anything about that. And we're done. Back to you, Rachel.
Great. Thanks so much, Sidya and Steve. I think this is a great time to be having this conversation. I think as a lot of us know, the American Rescue Plan passed a large expansion of the child tax credit that I think has been lauded by many as being a measure that has the potential to reduce, child poverty by half by providing, a predictable and stable amount of income. These payments are supposed to be starting to roll out in July. The IRS just this week released their non-filer portal for people who are currently outside of the tax system. So many of the people who are residing in these low-income and poor households that this policy was ostensibly intended to benefit. Early reviews are out, and there's reason to believe that this will fall short of many of, I think, the aspirations that were attached to this policy. So I really want to turn this over to Elaine and Matt, really kind of a 2-part question, one based on a lot of the research that Sidya and Steve shared with us about what we do know, an ideal, a well-considered, well-designed guaranteed income policy would look like. What compared to the child tax credit, what would you anticipate the performance of that to be? 1. And 2, given some of the gaps in knowledge that are still outstanding, and with the knowledge that hopefully this is the beta version and a 2.0 will follow. What are you hoping to learn in this CTC rollout that will hopefully inform a better design, more permanent version to follow? So how do you expect this to work now? And what are you hoping to learn that will help us do it better in the next version?
So it's my nature that the child tax credit is going to work really well for a lot of people. So roughly 95% of families with children are already in the tax system. So they're used to filing returns and the IRS will know how to reach them. The problems, of course, are that group of folks who, it's probably 2 to 3 million children who are truly, look like they're outside the tax system. They're showing up on health insurance forms, but they're not showing up on a tax return. So we need to find those children, and those are all citizen children. So there's also the group of children who don't have SSNs in this country, and they are just simply not eligible. So they are not only falling through the cracks, there's no way for them to climb up into the policy at this point. And then there's this question, particularly in low-income families, there's this, instability that happens. Children are moving between households. There's a lot of shared custody arrangements at all income ranges. And the tax system is a very blunt tool. We look at things on an annual basis. So where there are situations where a child is being cared for by multiple people, only one of those carers is ultimately gonna receive this benefit. And that makes it simpler to administer, but it means that some parents are simply not going to be found eligible for the credit. And I think I'll turn it over at that point.
Thanks, Elaine. Yeah, I mean, I think you're completely right that 95 or something like that are probably going to get it because they're in the tax system. And the nice thing is that this is getting rolled out after the IRS has kind of learned a little bit how to do this, right? And I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I feel like 85, 90% of people started figuring out, okay, you go to the forms and you do that. The one thing is that 5%, that maybe 5%, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 3% of people who aren't in the system but are eligible for it are also the people who really need this the most, right? Are the people who would really, really benefit from that sort of $300 a month. And also, this is addressed in the paper, these are often the people who, would be hard to get into it anyways, right? They're not just that they don't know about this, but they don't have a functioning bank account. They're worried about if they do have that, people start taking money out of that or anything like that. And then going back to the question about, what are we going to learn? I mean, the nice thing, like I said earlier, the more you do this stuff, the more you sort of build the capacities and internal resources to do this. The first stimulus checks that went out in 2020, it took 2 or 3 months to get to people. And it was really challenging. And, the last one in March, I feel got to most folks fairly quickly. At the same time, then you're okay, the IRS is now doing a lot of tax refunds. I think they're still behind with that. So I think learning, what they're going to do and how long it's going to take, and hopefully this is something that they can build these capacities in-house and do it quicker. Attached to that, I'll say, this is the child allowance program is, I think it's for 1.5 years. And one of the big questions that people have is is this going to be extended? And, at what level do you say, hey, maybe this isn't something that the IRS is good at. Maybe this is something that Social Security, who is in the send people a monthly tax thing, business, is going to be better at. And I think there's a good case for that. But that said, I think, the overall thing of do you have the databases? Do you know what people's addresses are? Do you know what their bank accounts are? These are just real big technical problems. And, so much of the problem, I think, is that we sort of assume that the US government has this information, that it has this database, that it's sorted in some sort of reasonable manner. And there's just nothing like that actually exists the way that we like to imagine it that it does. And so, just building that database is going to be a huge, huge undertaking, but also something that's going to really hopefully pay off over time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overestimating about the capabilities and capacity of our government infrastructure. There was a question in the chat that I think is related to this, and Matt, you kind of touched on it, the ability of other kinds of payment platforms to reach people maybe more efficiently, more quickly. SNAP, for instance, provides regular, monthly payments to many of the households who would anticipate are going to be who have non-filer status, right? There are other programs that have, different kinds of capacities already in place to shift resources. So one of the things that I'm wondering is like how much of the water of, the goals of guaranteed income do we think could like effectively be executed by an existing policy or program, and what would the benefits of potentially, designing a distinct and standalone program be?
I mean, I think we often talk about guaranteed income as, well, what can we piggyback off of? And people tend to look at, say, EITC, right? And they say, oh, the EITC is already there. So we can, maybe we'll get rid of the phase-in and maybe make it a bit larger or whatever. But of course, it's doing things through the tax code is maybe not the best way to do it if we want it to be, if we want to, reach more people, both in terms of ease of access on the front end. We know, for example, that, people who apply to get the EITC, like a good 50% of them use paid tax prep. And then the people who use paid tax prep, somewhere I think Hillary Hoynes had a paper where she noted that something like 15 to 20% of the average value of the EITC gets eaten up by fees from paid tax prep, right? So we want a system where we don't have, third-party middlemen involved. I mean, theoretically, you could build a tax system that doesn't do that, but that's not the one that we have. So it's something that I'm sensitive to. And certainly, in the long run, something like the Social Security Administration really does seem like it's set up to do this. I mean, obviously, they would have to build their capacity. They would need data from the IRS and others to sort of augment what they already have, but it seems like a good base to me. And you can quibble with the pay-fors on the Romney plan, but there was something kind of really elegant about the Romney child allowance proposal as opposed to the doing it through the existing sort of child tax credit system. So I'd love to see a shift toward that in the long run. I also like the idea in his plan of, again, just the back end phase out. I mean, if you have to have a phase out at all, doing it that way, where it's don't make people fill out forms and do complicated stuff to prove that they should get 85% of the benefit instead of 65% of the benefit. Just send everybody out the benefit and deal with it on the back end. And if you are going to have that phase out, it's important to consider, especially if you're doing something like a monthly payment, that you keep the phase out, fairly high up, because you can look at something like what happened in the UK with the sort of the universal credit, which is a monthly payment system where they're using essentially a running average of your previous month's income to determine what money you're going to get. And it turns out that if, fairly far up into the income distribution, there's a lot of income volatility on a month-to-month basis, not just on an annual basis. So that means that payments are going to be unexpectedly shifting up and down, that there may be, horrible tax issues surprises on the back end, like, oops, it turns out we overpaid you, you owe us $3,000 or whatever. So I think, these sorts of things need to be, in consideration. And yeah. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, and then, but that's not enough, right? We have to find ways to target undocumented, people outside the tax system, in informal economy, self-employed. So that's not going to be just enough. I think we have to expand our systems as well.
Yes. So I would plug that the IRS does contact and have contact with, plenty of people that don't have SSNs. They have a special filing number, that ITIN. So in that sense, they're more in touch with, folks without SSNs than Social Security Administration would be. And I think that's a careful, thing we need to consider with the policy. Donald Marin and I did a little work on carbon dividends. And, we sort of ended where you're talking about, where just send the benefit out, make it, universal, make it easy and simple, and then tax it on the back end, just like we do other types of income. Whether that involves some sort of withholding, I don't think that's going to end up necessary if you keep that, phase out point high enough. But it does seem like the more efficient way to make sure, you're not missing that person whose income suddenly falls out from beneath them, which I think should be a key consideration in all of these policies.
These are great points. One thing I'll just add too, if we're talking about like trying to do these things through SNAP or through EITC, like SNAP and EITC are probably the best programs out there, and I think get about an 80% enrollment as a percentage of eligibles, and like that's like the best we've got, right? And so it's definitely something where we have to aim a little bit higher than that.
Yeah, one last question for you guys before we open it up to audience questions. So I think one of the things that's so distinct about the child tax credit, outside of the things that we have already talked about, is the extent to which it's like socializing this set of design features that are for many people a new way of approaching the way that we distribute resources, especially to low-income households, right? For the most part, especially for people who already went in the tax system, it's automatic. It's regular cash-based payments. They're distributed irrespective of your employment status or wage income. So I'm wondering from all of you, if, we could kind of pluck one of these things and apply it to some of these other systems, right? To TANF, to SNAP. What would you think would have the greatest impact for the largest number of families?
I mean, everything should be cash, but other than being cash, I think getting rid of conditionality is I think huge, because I mean, for one thing, so imagine it's very strict, like you actually have to work, right? So much of that is outside of people's control. It's such a huge problem, especially during recessions, but not only during recessions. And we know from research that making your work condition safety net doesn't do very well during a recession. Go figure. But of course, those sorts of things, people are having all sorts of problems that we don't see that fall under the radar. Right now everybody's talking about the pandemic, and it's very salient that people lost their jobs who were dealing with that. But for some significant portion of households at any given time, there are these sorts of crises happening that fall under the radar that we don't see, and we have to recognize that. The second thing, and we also know that just even from an investment perspective, if you want to be very crass, right, that getting aid to families with children in particular, but to everybody, has a real payoff down the line in terms of health and criminal justice and all sorts of other things. So the idea that we have to be like, nope, sorry, you didn't work enough, we're not going to give you the aid, your kids are not going to get the aid, I think that's kind of crazy. But on top of it, but say we just get rid of that, we just say, oh no, you have to do, you don't have to necessarily have a job, but you have to prove that you're looking for a job, or you have to prove that you're going to training sessions or whatever. I mean, everybody knows how to deal with that and to game that, right? You send out your resumes and you do busy work and you sit in on sessions and you get licenses and certificates that don't do anything. It's essentially just making people jump through hoops for no good reason, right? And it creates this whole monitoring and enforcement capacity to determine that they're doing that. And it means that there's constant churn. Oops, I didn't fill out my paperwork in time, so now I lose benefits for 3 weeks and I have to go and deal with that. It just doesn't seem like it adds much. And I would like to see it gone. So I think getting rid of those sorts of just sort of either, really punitive on the one end or just sort of mindless hoop jumping on the other end, I think would be just a wonderful thing to do for our safety net, even if we did nothing else.
I want to add, not add much, but it takes away, right? The idea of a lot of these things is like, oh, we want to make it so it's conditional on work. We want to make it conditional on these things. And, again, we just don't have that information. We don't, we can't say that. And so what we end up doing is making people jump through all these hoops, But if you look at this is outside of basic income, but like you look at the stuff that's been doing where they attach work requirements to SNAP, they attach them to Medicaid. What you see a lot of people leave the programs. You don't see any improvement in employment because all you're doing is you're kicking people out because they're not spending 18 hours trying to find pay stubs and everything like that. And that's a huge hassle when you're a person living in poverty. It's a huge hassle for everyone, but people who are middle income and have jobs can take the weekend or take a day off to do that.
Not to mention that some of the programs have built in them, the TANF programs and UI programs in southern states that are more likely to have Black recipients. They focus on, marriage promotion or all these behavioral changes that, end up not to be very successful ever. And it's just this other burden. And when we allow things to just vary so much by state, we really facilitate some states sticking it to certain populations that I think is generally unfair. So I also like the idea of, a benefit that's not conditioned on, who your state legislators are and their, predispositions.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, Elaine, I mean, I think all of this speaks to, federalizing programs, right? Is there any set of conditions that you think would make sense to give state discretion over design and delivery of some of these programs? Like, how much of that do you think should be set at the federal level?
So we have examples in the disability world where we used to allow states to deliver, SSI payments, and then, it was just a horrible mess. So now SSI is largely, almost run completely by the federal government, though there's still state supplements. So I think there's just examples of it's just, the states act so differently, and it can be so punitive for some people that if you're going to have this program that's really truly supposed to work for everyone, it should operate at the federal level.
As a social scientist, it's great to have all that variation because we can do fun difference analyses and so forth. But as somebody who actually cares about combating poverty and doing it efficiently, we got to federalize this stuff.
I also just want to add, when you talk to, when you interview people who are experiencing these things and move state to state, people don't realize that sort of federal changes about that. I live in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, its TANF program is still called AFDC, right? Assistance for Families, and it's so confusing to folks because they all have different names, they have different programs. It just makes it really hard to navigate. So I think I'm with everybody else on push things towards federalization. If states are need something unique, Hawaii is more dependent on tourism, Alaska is more more restricted from other things. I think they can figure out other policies around that, but we also want to make one big policy that works for everybody as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that was a key finding of political scientist Jamila Mishner in some of the interviews that she did with people, about their experience at accessing Medicaid in state to state, that these differences of design, of accessibility, for people who are accessing these programs. I mean, they're interfacing with a representative of the government, and this is their experience of the state, and it is conferring, a political identity, a sense of belongingness, and having this level of unevenness across states, across programs also creates different political experiences and classes of people outside of their outside of the financial impact. And so, I mean, thinking about, how what kind of constituencies are being built around some of these programs. I think, again, going to, the point that you were making, Matt, about having a program that works well for everybody, right, is important to affirming that, the government is representing and is acting on everyone's collective behalf. So,
and well, I want to add one thing too. It's like one thing that's been interesting is with a lot of states and local areas are sort of overfunded right now because they got ARP money. And one thing I've been talking to a couple of different areas who are trying to do ways of doing basic income pilots, or also like going to some of the points that Elaine raised earlier, like are saying, okay, how can we support people who don't have social security numbers, that were not eligible for a lot of CARES Act? And so like there are some cases for this sort of localization.
Awesome, and I hate to cut it off here, but we are in fact past time. Thank you everyone for attending the session. If you would like to continue the conversation, you can head over to Como Space during the break to network, socialize, and view the artist exhibits. If you enjoyed the session, we have more coming up. So please check out the conference website for the complete schedule. And if you miss any sessions, the recordings are available to watch on Crowdcast using the same links from the schedule. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everyone who attended, and hope you all enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.